Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brian McClanahan. This is United States History 201, Presentation 1, Early Exploration, the Spanish and the French. So what we're going to talk about leading into the English settlement of the North American colonies is the Spanish and the French, and maybe some and a little bit of the exploration before that, as for example with the Vikings. But we're not going to get to the English till the next presentation, but we do have to kind of lay the groundwork for what was going to be here when the English eventually settled here. The Spanish were actually in North America first. Well, actually, the Vikings were in North America first, and then the Spanish. But so I will talk about that just a little bit, a couple of the very famous Spanish conquistadors that were in North America. And we'll look at the French settlement, primarily in Canada. But, of course, the French were on what was called the frontier, the Old Northwest, which would be the Great Lakes area, down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans. So they were an important part of the English colonial experience, and of course the interaction between the English and the French is going to lead to conflict, which will eventually lead to the American War for Independence. So all of this stuff is important leading into that. So let's get started. The Vikings may have explored North America by about 1000 A.D. There is evidence that Leif Erikson was sailing west. Of course, the Vikings were expanding all throughout Europe at this point, and Erikson and others of his ilk were colonizing different areas. For example, Iceland, which is not very icy. They called it that to keep people away. And Greenland, which is very icy, so they called it Greenland. But there's speculation Erikson may have gotten as far south as Virginia. There's no evidence that they had any permanent settlements here, though there is speculation they were in Minnesota, for example, and also perhaps maybe in Newfoundland and maybe in the New England states. But the Vikings were exploring as they were conquering other parts of Europe. They were a seafaring people. It's also important to note at this time that the sea levels around the world were much higher because the Earth was substantially warmer in the Middle Ages than it is today. So we were going through a very rapid phase of global warming caused by all the carbon dioxide emissions from these Viking ships, as you can see with all of their smokestacks. So obviously humans were causing this back in the 11th century A.D. as well. Christopher Columbus was the most important Spanish explorer, or most famous, I should say, Spanish explorer in history. Lived from 1451 to 1506. No one knows what he looks like, but this is a pretty good guess. In 1492, he was given funding by the Spanish court to find a trade route to India, sailing west. Everyone else went east. They sailed around. They went to the Canary Islands and down around Africa and got to India that way. Columbus believed you could sail west. Now, we didn't know there was a great big continent in the way. The Greeks did know how large the earth was. They had measured it very accurately much earlier than this. But that information, again, had been lost. This is where the Renaissance comes in. And also, no one thought the earth was flat at this point. Everyone knew it was round. They just didn't know how far they would go. So Columbus was an adventurous sort, wanted to go west. The Portuguese perhaps knew that South America was there, and they will eventually say that they did know later on. But Columbus had sailed quite a bit with the Portuguese, and so when the opportunity presented itself in 1492, when the Spanish actually had the money and the means, they were finished fighting Muslims in Spain to send an expedition. They did. This is all part of what's called the Age of Discovery. He took 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and eventually took 4 voyages to the New World. His first stop was in San Salvador, and eventually he would skirt the coast of Cuba, also what's called Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and then head back to the Canary Islands and back on into Spain. But Columbus, as you can see, would take 4 voyages. Now, why don't we call this area Columbia? Well, because no one really liked Christopher Columbus, and he had a cartographer on his trips named Amerigo Vespucci, on the first 2 anyways, and he was making maps. And so when a German cartographer picked up on these maps and looked at them, he called them America, or Amerigo's maps. And so the name just stuck. This is why we have North America, South America, and Central America today, and not North Columbus, South Columbus, and Central Columbus, or Columbia. Now, these Portuguese, as I said, claimed some of this land. They said, oh, wait, we knew about this too. And so they're going to petition the Pope to make a decision to divide the land up. The Portuguese were interested in their African interests. The Spanish wanted the New World in the Americas. And so essentially what the Pope did is say, okay, we're going to draw a line in the sand. Spain, you get everything west of that line. Portugal, you get everything east of that line. And so you can see my mouse here. Spain would get all of this, and Portugal would get essentially what's now Brazil and Africa. But this was a great coup for the Spanish because, of course, they're able to use this land to mine and gain natural and mineral resources out of the New World, which makes them, for a time, the wealthiest country in Europe. Now, eventually, you would have several Spanish conquistadors coming to the New World to make money, to have fame, to get land, make a name for themselves. And one of the most famous is a man named Juan Ponce de Leon, lived from 1474 to 1521. He was the first governor of Puerto Rico. He claimed to name Florida for the Spanish in 1513. Perhaps he was searching for a fountain of youth. No one really knows. Of course, if you watch the Pirates of the Caribbean, you know he found it. He just couldn't leave. Florida means land of flowers. So the name Florida actually has a Spanish name. He was killed in an Indian attack in 1521, and the Spanish would establish the first permanent European colony in North America in Florida, St. Augustine, in 1565. So the Spanish had the first permanent European colony here in the New World, St. Augustine, 1565. It's been there for over 400 years. We're actually going up to the 450th anniversary this next year, which is pretty interesting. Hernando de Soto was another very important Spanish conquistador. He was the first European to cross the Mississippi River, explored much of what's now the South for the Spanish between 1539 and 1542. In fact, ran into the Choctaw tribe and Chief Tuscaloosa. He would defeat the Choctaw and Chief Tuscaloosa over near what's now Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And this is why that area is named that way. But De Soto perhaps landed in Tampa Bay, went north, maybe into the Carolinas, came down back through Georgia and then Alabama, went down to Mobile, and then perhaps back north across the Mississippi. All along the way, he's trying to, of course, gain money, but he's also trying to convert the Indian tribes to Christianity, which didn't usually work very well. A lot of dead missionaries are found even buried along rivers even to this day. And there's perhaps his voyage. You can see maybe he went to Mobile Bay, but nobody really knows. It's very difficult to know what exact path he took. There is the DeSoto Caverns and DeSoto Falls in Alabama, both named after Hernando de Soto. And you can see the red line is until De Soto died. He would die, and then he would be buried in a river, in the Mississippi River, so that people wouldn't know he was dead, because that was the Indian tribes apparently thought that he was some type of immortal being, and knowing that he's dead is not going to work well for the rest of his group. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was a Spanish explorer who explored the southwestern interior of North America for Spain, perhaps looking for the 7 cities of gold between 1540 and 1542. So here he is. He made it as far north as Kansas and ran into some of the Plains Indian tribes there. So that's really interesting that here you have in 1542 the Spanish penetrating the interior of North America, far into the interior of North America. There's De Soto in the Mississippi, crossing the Mississippi River. Again, this gives you a nice image of what he would have had with him: missionaries, Christian missionaries, weapons, trade goods, but coming in contact with the Indian tribes. As I mentioned before, St. Augustine, Florida was founded in 1565, the first permanent European colony in North America. There was actually an attempt in 1558 to found a permanent colony, Pensacola, Florida. It didn't work out. It was blown away by a hurricane. But Pensacola today, if you go into the old part of the city, is still very influenced by the Spanish. There's the Via de Luna, the names of the roads, Cervantes, which they call, but it's actually Cervantes Street. So it's very much influenced by the Spanish today. That's one of the oldest buildings, by the way, in St. Augustine, or the oldest building in St. Augustine. Now, the French would follow the Spanish into the New World. All attempts at early settlement for the French, though, in the 16th century failed, and thus New France is little more than a fur trading and fishing outpost of the French kingdom. In 1712, the French would control much of North America, from Canada south of the Gulf of Mexico, which is New Orleans, and west of the Pacific. Now, early on, the French explorers were primarily men, the settlers were primarily men, so the king himself, King of France, actually devised a plan to have, and this would be Louis XIV, to have women come to the New World. They were called the filles du roi, which meant the daughters of the king. And what they did is went to Paris and rounded up a bunch of the prostitutes in Paris, told them they're going to go to the New World, marry Frenchmen, and have babies. And this is what they did. So they cleaned up the prostitution problem in Paris and sent these people over here so they could have children and repopulate. It's kind of hard to have a large, vibrant population without any women. So this actually helped populate parts of New France. You had Catholic New France, though, and Protestant New France. France is a Catholic country, but you did have some areas of New France that were also heavily influenced by what were called the Huguenots. They were French Protestants, and so you did have some conflict in New France. And eventually a lot of these Huguenots would actually end up in places like Charleston, South Carolina, where they were seeking refuge in the English colonies. Now, Jacques Cartier was one of the great early French explorers. Again, no one knows what he looked like. This is a good guess. Lived from 1491 to 1557, claimed New France and named it Canada in 1534, discovered and named the St. Lawrence River as well. Samuel de Champlain was called the father of New France, lived from 1574 to 1635. No one knows what he looked like, but again, a good guess. Found in Quebec in 1608, explored much of the region for the French, including the Great Lakes. And then you had Robert de La Salle, the great French explorer from 1643 to 1687, explored the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Basin for the French. The French are moving from what's now Canada down through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, and ending up ultimately in the Gulf of Mexico. So think of that. There's forts all along these particular areas because the French are establishing outposts, trading posts, defensive positions. And so when the English finally get here, the English are going to be settling along the east coast. They got the Spanish to the south, the French to the west and the north. So what you're going to have in this colonial period was a tremendous amount of struggle between these three powers and also the Indian tribes, which were put in the middle of a lot of this stuff because they were either aligned with the French or the English or the Spanish. And so you have these back and forth alliances. It's going to make for a very contentious situation and ultimately lead to bloodshed. All right, we'll pick up with the settlement of the English colonies next time. I'll see you then.